Nobody at the Hartwell Grand expected the girl who spilled champagne on Senator Aldridge's wife to be the same girl who would save a man's mother from a bullet 3 hours later. But that's exactly what happened. And nothing, not the whispers, not the headlines, not the 6 weeks Bridget Okafor spent in physical therapy afterward, nothing ever made sense of it the way the truth did. Bridget had been working the Hartwell Grand for 11 months. Not because she loved hospitality, not because she dreamed as a little girl in Youngstown, Ohio, of carrying silver trays through marble hallways. She worked there because it paid $18.40 an hour plus gratuity, because her landlord had raised the rent in February without warning, and because the uniform, a grey dress with white trim cut for women half her size, at least came with a dry cleaning allowance. She was 26 years old, 262 pounds, and possessed of the particular kind of competence that goes entirely unnoticed. She remembered orders without writing them down. She knew which guests preferred their water still and which wanted it sparkling before they asked. She could carry 4 full trays up a flight of stairs without touching the railing. None of this was ever remarked upon. What people remarked upon was that she walked too slowly, that she seemed tired, that perhaps she ought to take the service elevator rather than appear in the lobby during peak hours. Her supervisor, a thin-wristed man named Aldous, and no one at the Hartwell ever used last names, it was a whole thing, had once told her that guests respond to energy, which was his way of saying he found her presence aesthetically inconvenient. Bridget had nodded, smiled, and gone back to work. She was good at nodding and smiling. She'd had 26 years of practice. The night of the Voss Industries charity gala, Bridget was assigned to the East Ballroom, which meant she was on champagne duty for 300 guests, most of whom had spent more on their outfits than she earned in a year. The event was a fundraiser, something to do with children's hospitals, which struck Bridget as bitterly funny, because the man hosting it had not, as far as anyone could tell, ever been kind to a child in his life. His name was Dorian Voss. Bridget had seen photographs. She'd read enough to know that Dorian Voss was 41 years old, that he'd inherited control of his family's shipping empire at 32 when his father died under circumstances that the official report called cardiac event, and that everyone in the city called something else. She knew he controlled 3 legitimate businesses, and, if the rumors printed carefully in oblique language by certain journalists were to be believed, at least as many illegitimate ones. She knew he had grey at his temples and a face that looked like it had been designed to discourage questions. She knew his fiancée was a woman named Isabeau, French mother, Texas money, very beautiful in the way of things that had been maintained at considerable expense. What Bridget did not know, could not have anticipated, was that Dorian Voss had a mother, which was a strange thing not to know, because of course everyone had a mother. But Dorian Voss seemed like the kind of man who had arrived on Earth fully formed, in a suit already bored. And yet, at 8:47 in the evening, Bridget was moving through the East Wing corridor with a tray of fresh glasses when she saw a woman standing at the window at the end of the hall, looking out at the parking structure with the expression of someone who had completely lost the thread of where they were. She was small, maybe 5 feet, wearing a black dress that had been carefully pressed and a strand of pearls. Her hair was white and pinned with the precision of a woman who had once cared very much about how she looked and had not yet stopped, even if the reasons were growing harder to hold on to. Bridget slowed. She'd seen this before. Not here, not in this context, but she'd seen it at her grandmother's house in Youngstown in the last 2 years before the end, when her grandmother would sometimes surface from a conversation and look around the room with that particular quality of lostness that was different from ordinary confusion. It was quieter, it was more absolute. Bridget set her tray down on the hall credenza and walked toward the woman, "Hi there," she said, keeping her voice level and easy the way she'd learned. "Not too bright, not too quiet. Somewhere between." The woman turned. She had dark eyes, still sharp in the way that some people's eyes stayed sharp, even when everything else was slipping. She looked at Bridget with a kind of careful attention. "I was looking for the garden," the woman said. "There used to be a garden." "There's a courtyard," Bridget said. "I can take you there if you'd like. I just need to set these glasses down first." The woman considered this. "You're not from here either." "No," Bridget said. "I'm from Ohio. I'm from Palermo," the woman said, as though this settled something. Her name, Bridget would learn later, was Concetta Voss, née Ferrara, 73 years old, and she had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia 14 months ago, a fact that Dorian had shared with no one outside his immediate inner circle, which did not include his fiancée's mother, his business associate, or the event planner who had placed Concetta at table 4 without considering that table 4 was adjacent to the main bar, and that noise at a certain frequency made Concetta's hands shake. Bridget didn't know any of this. She just knew what she saw, and what she saw was a woman who needed someone to walk alongside her. She found a junior staff member to cover her section, took Concetta to the courtyard, and sat with her on a stone bench for 12 minutes, while Concetta talked about a lemon tree she had grown up near in Sicily and asked Bridget 3 times whether she'd eaten dinner. "I had something earlier," Bridget said each time. "You work too hard," Concetta said. "I can see it in your face." At 9 o'clock, Bridget gently suggested they go back inside. She walked Concetta to the edge of the ballroom, found a quiet seat near the east wall, and flagged down another server to bring water. She was about to return to her own section when she heard the sound of a chair scraping back, and then a voice. Low, controlled, the kind of controlled that meant the opposite of calm. "What are you doing out of your seat?" Isabeau was standing at the edge of the table. She was, in person, even more striking than photographs suggested. Tall, black-haired, wearing a white gown that managed to look both effortless and like it had taken months to find. Her voice was honey over gravel, and she was directing it entirely at Concetta. Concetta blinked. "I went to find the garden." The garden. Isabeau's expression did something complicated. "Dorian's going to be furious. Do you understand what tonight is? Do you understand how many people are watching?" "I wanted to show the young woman the garden," Concetta said, a little uncertainly now. "She's from Ohio." Isabeau looked at Bridget for the first time. It was the kind of look that categorized and dismissed simultaneously. "You?" A pause. "What section are you assigned to?" "East Wing Corridor, currently reassigned to." "You should be with your section." Another pause. "And you, back to Concetta now, need to understand that when you disappear like that, it reflects on Dorian. It reflects on all of us. You cannot just wander." Concetta's chin lifted slightly. "I am not wandering. I know exactly where I am." It was said with dignity, and Bridget felt something tighten in her chest, because she recognized that too, the instinctive rally, the moment of clarity deployed in self-defense, the way her grandmother had sometimes pulled herself together just long enough to say something so precisely lucid that it broke your heart. Isabeau leaned down, not close enough to be touching, but close enough to be unmistakable. "You don't, actually," she said quietly, "and everyone in this room can tell." Concetta's expression flickered. Isabeau's right hand moved. Bridget didn't decide. There was no decision. Her body simply moved ahead of her mind, stepping forward and slightly to the left, placing herself between Isabeau's hand and Concetta's face, catching the blow across the side of her own neck and upper shoulder. It landed harder than she'd expected. Isabeau was wearing a ring, a large statement piece, platinum and some kind of dark stone, heavily set, and the edge of it caught Bridget just below her ear. There was a bright, specific pain, and then a kind of electric heat that spread down the left side of her neck. The room went very quiet, not silent, There was still music, still the clink of glassware from the far end of the ballroom, but in their immediate radius, a pocket of complete stillness opened up. Isabeau stared at Bridget. Bridget became aware, distantly, that her left hand was shaking. She put it behind her back. "That," said Isabeau slowly, "was a very stupid thing to do. Maybe," Bridget said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "But she's not going to be hit tonight." She didn't shout it. She didn't need to. But several people nearby had turned to look, and the particular way that rooms process scenes like this, the spreading awareness, the whispers moving outward like ripples, was already in motion. Isabeau's eyes went flat. "Do you have any idea who I am?" "I know who you are," Bridget said. "I also know that she is a woman in her 70s sitting at a table at a charity event, and she hasn't done anything wrong." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then someone behind Bridget said, "Step aside." It was not loud. It did not need to be. She turned. Dorian Voss was not a tall man, 5'11", maybe, not particularly imposing in terms of height. What made him imposing was something else entirely, some quality of the air around him, as though everything in his immediate vicinity had quietly realigned its priorities. He was looking at Bridget with an expression that she could not read at all, which was itself frightening, because Bridget was good at reading people. He was also looking at her neck. "What happened?" he said. It was directed at her, not at Isabeau, which she registered only because it was unexpected. There was a misunderstanding," Bridget started. "There was not a misunderstanding," said a voice from the small cluster of people that had gathered nearby. One of the other servers, a young man named Terence, who had been watching from 6 feet away with a tray of canapés going cold in his hands. "She stepped in front of your mother. The ring caught her on the neck." Dorian's gaze moved to Isabeau. Whatever passed between them in that moment, Bridget could not follow. It was too fast, too compressed, communicated in some private language built over years. Isabeau's expression moved through several things in rapid succession and then settled into something carefully composed. "Dorian," she was wondering. "I was simply—" "Go back to the main table," he said. It was not a request. A muscle in Isabeau's jaw moved. She straightened. She looked at Bridget one more time, not with anger now, or not only anger, but with something more precise, more calculating, which Bridget would later understand to be much more dangerous, and then she walked away. Dorian turned to his mother. The shift in him was immediate and stark. He crouched down so he was at eye level with Concetta, took her hands in his, and said something to her in Italian, quiet and direct. Concetta said something back. He nodded. He said something else. His voice was completely different from the voice he'd used for everything else that evening. Softer, more careful, like someone handling something irreplaceable. Then he stood, said something to the aide who had appeared at his elbow, and Concetta was gently and unobtrusively guided toward a quieter part of the room. Dorian looked at Bridget. "She stayed calm," he said. It took Bridget a moment to realize he was talking about Concetta. "She has good instincts," Bridget said. "She knew something was off, but she didn't panic." A pause. "You know what's happening with her?" It wasn't a question. Bridget hesitated, then said, "My grandmother had something similar. I recognized it." He studied her. Up close, his face was harder to read than in photographs, not cold exactly, but sealed, like a document that required a specific key. He was looking at her neck with an expression that was not quite concern, but was adjacent to it. "You should have that looked at," he said. "I'm fine. The ring she wears," he said carefully, "is not a standard piece of jewelry." Bridget blinked. She didn't know what to do with that sentence. "Okay," she said. "You should see the hotel's physician tonight." Then he walked away, just like that, with the abruptness of a man who considered conversations finished when he was done with them. Bridget stood still for a moment. The electric heat in her neck had not faded. If anything, it had spread further down toward her shoulder. She reached up and pressed her fingers lightly against the area below her ear, And when she brought them away, the fingertips were clean. No blood. But there was a faint redness in the shape of the ring's edge, and something else underneath, something she couldn't name, a sensation that was less like pain and more like interference. She told herself it was nothing. She went back to work. She made it another 40 minutes. It was Terence who noticed first. He came to find her near the service station and said, "Hey, are you? Your hands are shaking. I'm tired," she said. "Bridget, look at me." She looked at him. He looked back at her, with an expression that told her something was wrong before she had time to understand what. "Your face," he said. "The left side. It's—" She put her hand up to her cheek. Her fingers felt numb. Not pins and needles numb, but absent, as though the signals weren't arriving. "That's probably just stress," she said. "I'm getting the manager. Terence, I don't want." But he was already moving. What happened next occurred in a series of images, bright and disconnected. The way things fragment when your body is doing something alarming and your brain is trying to catch up. Someone brought a chair. Someone called for medical assistance. She was aware of the event still happening around her, the string quartet, the speeches, the clink of glasses, and she was aware that she was being moved away from it, through a set of double doors, into a quieter hallway, and then Dorian Voss was there. She didn't understand that part until later. She didn't understand why he would leave his own event, his own guests, to follow a hotel employee into a service corridor. Later she would learn that someone from his security detail had come to find him at the table within minutes of Terence calling for help. Because Dorian Voss maintained a comprehensive awareness of what occurred in his immediate environment, always, and because someone on his staff had been watching Bridget since she'd stepped in front of Concetta and had noticed when she started deteriorating. He was on the phone when he came through the doors, and he ended the call immediately. She said she was fine. Terence was saying to someone. "She was wrong," said Dorian. He crouched down in front of the chair she'd been placed in. He looked at her face with the same kind of directed attention he'd turned on his mother, precise and unsparing. "The ring has a pressure plate," he said. "On the underside. It's coated with a compound that enters through the skin." He said this the way you'd say a thing you'd rather not be saying, clearly and without embellishment. "We need to treat this now." Bridget stared at him. "Your fiancé's ring is not something I was aware of until 6 minutes ago. Why would she?" "Not here," he said. His physician arrived, a woman named Dr. Ellison, who materialized in the corridor, as though she'd been waiting for exactly this. And Bridget was treated with something administered through a small device pressed to her inner wrist. The numbness began to recede within minutes, first from her face, then gradually from her neck. The process was uncomfortable in a specific way, like sensation coming back to a foot that had been asleep, but at a larger scale and longer duration. Through most of it, Dorian Voss sat in the corridor and did not leave. This was the part that confused Bridget most. She kept expecting him to go. She kept thinking at each new moment that this would be the one where he stood and said something dismissing and went back to his event. But he stayed. He took calls on his phone, spoke in clipped sentences, gave instructions she couldn't fully follow, and stayed. At one point his aide appeared with a message. He read it, said something quiet and precise, and the aide went away looking purposeful. Later, Bridget would learn that Isabeau had attempted to leave the hotel at around 9:50, which was approximately when it became clear that the compound in the ring had not had the intended effect. She had been, in language used by the event report, which Bridget would never officially see but would eventually hear about through channels, detained pending clarification of circumstances. The circumstances, once clarified, had been unambiguous. The ring had been specially commissioned. The compound had been intended for Concetta. Isabeau had believed that Dorian's attachment to his mother was the central obstacle to her own position in his life, and she had decided to address this in the most decisive way she could think of. She had not anticipated the girl from Ohio. When the medical portion of the evening was concluded and Bridget had been cleared to move, Dorian stood. She stood too, still feeling slightly unreal, her left hand not entirely its usual self yet. "I want to ask you something," he said. She waited. "Why did you step in? You had no obligation to. She's not your family. You didn't know who she was." Bridget thought about this. It was a real question, asked in a real way, not rhetorical, not testing. He genuinely wanted to know. "She reminded me of my grandmother," she said finally. "And I've never been able to watch someone look at another person the way she was looking at your mother. The way she was looking, like your mother wasn't fully a person anymore. Like the dementia had reclassified her into something you could just." She stopped. "I'm sorry, that's—" "No," he said. She waited again. "That's accurate," he said. "That's exactly what it was." He looked at her for a moment and something in his face moved. Not an expression exactly, more like a shift in the underlying structure, something that had been held rigid allowing itself, briefly, to change. "You'll have paid medical leave for as long as you need it," he said. "Your regular salary. There will also be a separate figure deposited in your account by morning, which is not your employer's doing and is not negotiable. You don't need to. I don't do things because I need to," he said. "I do them because I've decided to. There's a difference." There was a long pause. The corridor was quiet. Somewhere beyond the double doors, the gala was still proceeding, the string quartet still playing. 300 people raising money for children's hospitals, and none of them with any idea what had transpired 20 feet away. "Your mother," Bridget said, "is lucky to have someone who cares that much." He looked at her sharply. Not a bad look, something more like surprise, quickly controlled. "She doesn't remember most of what I do," he said. "She doesn't have to," Bridget said. "You do it anyway. That's the part that matters." He looked at her for another moment in the particular way he had, that was not readable, not entirely, but that she was beginning to develop a small vocabulary for. Then he said, "What's your name?" "Bridget," she said. "Bridget Okafor." And then she stopped because she realized the problem. "Wait. You should know. I actually have to check whether you have. You need to know my name first before I can." She was fumbling now, tired and slightly loopy from the treatment, and she stopped herself. "Sorry. Bridget Okafor. That's my name." Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Not exactly anything she had a name for yet. But it was there. "I know," he said. "I knew when you were assigned to this event," which should have been alarming, probably. Which she would, at a later point, unpack very carefully. But in the corridor of the Hartwell Grand at 11 minutes past 10, with the feeling still returning to her left hand, and her neck still carrying the ghost of what had been intended for someone else, Bridget Okafor looked at Dorian Voss and thought only that he had stayed. That through all of it, he had stayed. "Go home," he said. "Get some sleep." "Is covered," he said. She wanted to argue. She was, by nature and by practice, someone who did not accept things easily, who had learned to be skeptical of generosity because generosity usually came with terms. But she was also, at this particular moment, very tired, and the left side of her neck ached, and the hotel corridor smelled like cleaning solution and old carpet, and she thought about her apartment, small and warm and hers, and she thought about how strange this night had been, and how stranger still it would become, though she did not know that yet. "Okay," she said. She took the service exit. She didn't look back, because she had learned not to, because looking back was a way of hoping, and hoping was something she'd trained herself to be careful about. Behind her, she heard the double doors open and close again. She heard footsteps going the other direction, back toward the ballroom, back toward the responsibilities and the empire, and the 300 guests who needed a host. She stepped out into the October air, and the city was cold and bright and entirely indifferent to what had just happened to her, which was fine, which was usual, which was, she told herself, how things worked. She walked to the bus stop on 5th, sat down on the bench and waited. Her phone buzzed, an unknown number. She looked at it for a long time before she answered. "Okafor," said the voice on the other end. "Yes," she said. "The physician will follow up with you tomorrow at 9. Don't ignore the call." A pause. She almost asked how he had her number, but she'd already intuited the answer to that particular question. "Okay," she said. "And Okafor?" "Yes." A pause so brief she almost missed it. "Thank you," said Dorian Voss. She sat on the bench for a while, after he hung up in the cold October air, with the city moving past her the way cities do, indifferent, bright, ongoing. She thought about her grandmother and the lemon tree in Sicily, and the way some people stay lucid in exactly the ways that matter. She thought about the way Conchetta had said, "I know exactly where I am," with her chin up, meaning it, in the way you mean things when you're defending them. She thought about what it was to step in front of something without thinking, to have your body know what was right before your mind had caught up. She didn't know what came next. She didn't know what Dorian Voss decided about things, or what his empire looked like from the inside, or what happened to people who crossed him, or what it meant that he had followed her into a service corridor and stayed until she was all right. She didn't know any of the things she would come to know gradually, and with the kind of difficulty that turns out to be worth it. She only knew what had happened tonight, the woman at the window looking for a garden. The ring. The way a room goes quiet. The bus came. She got on. Outside the window, the city moved past, golden and unknowing, the way it always does, carrying everyone's stories at once, confusing none of them with the others, holding them separate and whole, each one going somewhere the others couldn't follow.